I spent 3 weeks painting my son's graduation portrait, brushstroke by careful brushstroke, without even stopping to rest my aching wrists. Each layer of paint was a prayer, every shade a memory. The radio's soft music kept me company until midnight, filling the hours like the echo of my own life, which felt like it was fading slowly into the background. When I finished, the morning light streamed through my small window and landed on the canvas. It was beautiful. It didn't have the polish of professional gallery pieces or the price tag of renowned artists, but it was painted with the love of a father who, even after years of being invisible, still believed that genuine effort could bridge any distance. I carried the portrait with trembling hands, wrapped in brown paper to protect it. When I arrived at my son Levi's apartment downtown, he was surrounded by his colleagues, laughing and drinking expensive coffee from designer mugs. He looked like one of those polished, untouchable young professionals you see in magazines. For a moment, I felt a wave of pride wash over me, and then it happened. Levi glanced up, looked me over from head to toe, and asked, "Is that the painting?" I nodded, smiling. I unwrapped it carefully, like revealing something precious. He stared at it for maybe 5 seconds, and then, with a cold smirk, he waved it away. "This looks like something from a flea market," he said. His friends chuckled quietly. Before I could respond, he grabbed the portrait and leaned it against the wall near the trash. "I'm not hanging amateur work in my office, Dad. I have a reputation to maintain." I felt the oxygen leave my chest. I didn't say anything, not a single word. I just picked up what was left of my pride and walked out slowly before they could see the tears forming. I walked back to my small apartment. My vision blurred. The sun was bright overhead, but I only felt emptiness. The portrait was still in my mind, every brushstroke burning like an open wound. I thought of the sleepless nights, the years working at the community center teaching art classes for almost nothing, the paint stains on my hands that never fully washed away, everything I had sacrificed so Levi could reach where he was. And I wondered when love became something to be ashamed of. When I got home, I sat in front of my easel. I stared at it for a long time. Its familiar presence, once so comforting, now seemed to mock me. I touched the palette, seeking solace in its texture, and felt a strange impulse rising. It wasn't sadness. It was something new, a quiet, dangerous resolve. The kind of resolve that only comes when a heart breaks and, instead of shattering completely, begins to plan. Days passed, and my son never called, not even to check in. I heard through mutual acquaintances that his professional photographer had delivered his official portrait, imported from New York, perfect, as he described it. But perfection has no soul, and that photograph, no matter how flawless, could never tell his real story. Then one evening, I went back to his building. I waited until he left for a dinner meeting and slipped inside using the spare key he'd forgotten I still had. The scent of expensive cologne and fresh flowers filled the air, but in the corner by the kitchen, my portrait still leaned against the wall. Waiting, discarded but not destroyed, just like me. I picked it up gently, held it close to my chest, and took it home. I spread it out on my work table and examined it under the evening light. It was beautiful, even in its rejection, like a parent who continues to love even after being wounded. I ran my hand over the canvas and felt my love still living there within every layer of paint. And then I knew. That portrait was not going to be forgotten. For the following nights, I locked myself in my studio. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. I just painted. I added gold leaf to the frame. I layered deeper colors into the background. And within every stroke of paint, I hid more than just artistic technique. I hid my history. I placed one brushstroke for every tear, one shade for every sacrifice, one detail for every day I spent feeling worthless. As the portrait transformed, so did I. I was no longer the passive father who accepted his son's contempt in silence. I was a man who understood that love doesn't mean enduring everything, but choosing what deserves to be honored. When I finished, the mirror reflected a different image. My eyes no longer held defeat, but determination. The portrait glowed beneath the studio lamp, and its brilliance held something more than beauty. It held truth. Paintbrushes have always been my truest companions. Since I was 14, when my father first taught me to mix colors, I knew that this would be my way of speaking to the world. I was never a man of many words, but my hands could express things my voice could not. And for decades, among canvases, paints, and solitude, I learned that every painting could hold a story, even a lifetime. When my wife passed away, Levi was only 7 years old. Aurora died from cancer, And from one day to the next, I was left alone with a little boy and an unfinished mural. I remember crying that night in the studio. But the next morning, I picked up my brush, wiped away my tears, and started to paint. From that moment on, every piece that left my hands carried a promise. I would never let my son feel abandoned. We lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment above the community center, where I taught art classes. Levi did his homework at a table surrounded by paint tubes and canvases he sometimes used to create imaginary worlds. I watched him draw and thought that one day all this sacrifice would make sense. That one day he would understand that love can also be painted. For years, my hands ached from painting murals for schools, portraits for strangers, custom pieces for people who could afford what I never would. Sometimes while painting the family portraits of wealthy clients, I imagined what it would be like when my own son achieved his dreams. I dreamt of painting him the most meaningful portrait in the world, not because it was expensive, but because it would be made with the only thing I was never short on, love. When Levi turned 16, I was able to buy him his first new laptop, not secondhand, not borrowed, but new. It was sleek and silver with his initials I engraved on the case myself. That night, watching him explore it with wonder, I felt that everything had been worth it. He hugged me tight and whispered, "You're the best dad in the world." That phrase stayed with me. I didn't know that years later those same words would sound like a distant echo, like a broken promise. Levi grew up, and over the years he began to drift away from the world that had shaped us. He went to business school upstate, thanks to a small loan I secured by selling my wife's jewelry. He worked hard, climbed the corporate ladder, and met different people. When he returned, he was a stranger. His voice had changed, and his perspective had too. He no longer called me dad, but father. And every time I spoke, I noticed a flicker of embarrassment and impatience on his face. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But the signs were there. The calls he didn't return, the increasingly brief visits, and that comment he made one day without looking me in the eye. "I wish you had pursued something more stable." That phrase cut through my heart like a blade because without knowing it, he was telling me that the love I gave wasn't enough. That my hands, the very hands that painted his childhood, no longer held value in his world. Even so, when he told me he was graduating with his MBA and getting promoted to senior director, I felt pure, innocent joy. I thought I could finally give him the gift I had dreamt of for so many years, his portrait, a symbol of how far he'd come. I offered to paint it myself, and although he hesitated, he finally agreed. I took it as a sign of reconciliation, an opportunity to mend what distance had broken. That night, I sat in front of my easel and prayed before starting. "Lord, guide my hands. Let every stroke be a blessing." I spent whole days choosing the right canvas, the perfect paints. Cobalt blue for his suit, warm amber for the background light, and tiny flecks of silver a former client had given me as payment. Every brushstroke carried a wish, every layer a hidden tear. And in the corner, where no one else could see it, I painted a tiny butterfly, the same one I had painted on Aurora's final canvas. It was my way of telling him without words, "Take us with you, son. Even if you no longer see us, we will be there." But when it was all finished, and he rejected it, it wasn't just the portrait he discarded. It was my story, my love, the invisible thread that still connected us. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed watching the easel, empty now, and thought of my father, how he too painted until he was exhausted. He always told me, "Son, men like us don't have power or wealth. Our strength is in our vision." And in that moment, I understood. My strength was not in being accepted, but in continuing to create my own truth, even if they ignored it over and over again. I touched the canvas I had rescued again. I ran my fingers over the paint and felt my love still breathing within it. I thought of all the times I reached out without being reached back. The uncomfortable silences, the "Dad, please don't dress like that" to my office moments. And I understood that humiliation, if transformed with patience, could also become a lesson because pain doesn't destroy, it rebuilds. And that rebuilding had already begun. Over the following days, something shifted in me. I began to paint, not for him, but for myself. Every stroke was a way to heal. The brush moved smoothly, almost as if the canvas understood my soul. I was no longer creating a portrait. I was creating my liberation. And though Levi didn't know it, I already had a plan. On his graduation day, he would display the portrait he commissioned, but everyone would remember the one he rejected. Because some loves are forgotten, and others are honored with dignity, and mine was about to shine. The graduation day dawned under a gray sky. It wasn't raining, but the air felt heavy, as if the whole world sensed that something was about to shift. I dressed in the only decent suit I owned, the same one I had worn to Aurora's funeral, and carefully combed my hair, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because that day I was going to face my past with my head held high. I carefully wrapped the restored portrait in a canvas cloth, folded with the precision of someone guarding a treasure. It was neither a gift nor a complaint. It was a statement, a silent answer to a son who had forgotten what it means to love without conditions. When I left the apartment, the wind was picking up. I walked to the subway station, my hands clutching the wrapped canvas as if it were my own heart. The ride to the University Convention Center was long, and at every stop, I remembered the moments when my son and I were one, when we laughed at nothing, when he hugged me without fear of being seen. But those memories now stung more than any rejection. The graduation venue was massive, with marble columns and a ceiling so high it seemed to touch the heavens. Crystal chandeliers, elegant floral arrangements, champagne glasses sparkling on tables. Everything was perfect. Perfect and cold. I paused at the entrance for a few seconds, watching people mingle, toast, and take photographs. Levi was in the center, gleaming in his designer suit, standing beside his commissioned portrait on an expensive easel. A photograph that, despite its professional quality, failed to capture the warmth in his soul, if any remained. When he saw me, his smile faltered. I walked toward him, but before I could reach him, a woman, the dean's wife, I presumed, approached and blocked my path with a polite but strained smile. "You must be Levi's father, correct?" I nodded. "Ah, lovely to meet you," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Could you perhaps wait over there? We're about to begin the formal presentations." She looked me up and down with that evaluating gaze that weighs more than words, the same judgment I had endured in silence so many times. And I obeyed. I stayed at the back near the curtains, like a shadow at my own son's celebration. During the ceremony, no one spoke to me. Some offered polite nods. Others simply pretended I wasn't there. Levi didn't even acknowledge me during his speech. I was not his father that day. I was just an uncomfortable reminder he preferred to hide. The music began. Colleagues congratulated him, and the room erupted in applause. I applauded too, but my hands were trembling, not from pride, but from contained resolve. I watched my son accept his award, so confident, so self-assured, as if success finally belonged to him alone. And for a moment, I wondered if he had forgotten who held him up when life tried to break him, who taught him to dream, who painted his first room, who traded sleep for hope. And then I knew. He hadn't forgotten. He had simply denied it. Because sometimes love hurts so much that you prefer to bury it rather than honor it. I decided to stay a little longer, not to celebrate him, but to observe. I wanted to understand at what moment my son ceased to be my son. One of his colleagues approached me with an awkward smile. "Can I get you anything, sir?" "Just observing," I replied. "Observing what?" "How a father becomes invisible." The young man lowered his gaze, not knowing what to say. I smiled calmly. There was no anger in my voice, just an old, deep sadness that was no longer looking for explanations. At exactly 8 o'clock, when the reception was in full swing and conversations covered all silence, I rose from my seat and walked toward the center of the hall. The portrait was in my hands. Eyes turned toward me one by one until the murmuring ceased. Levi turned, confused, color draining from his face. "What are you doing, Dad?" he whispered nervously. "Please sit down." "I only came to return something that belongs to both of us," I said, unwrapping the canvas cloth. The murmuring returned, louder this time. Some laughed nervously, others stood frozen. I opened the cloth carefully and revealed the portrait. The same one he had called amateur work, but it was no longer the same. It shimmered. The hall lights reflected off the gold leaf I had applied, and the restored details looked as if they were painted by masters. It was a portrait worthy of any gallery. The silence was absolute. Levi took a step back, his eyes filling with tears, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't my fault. "What is this?" he whispered, trembling. "Your portrait, son. The one you rejected. But look at it now." "Yes," I said calmly. "I transformed it just as I transformed myself. You discarded it, but I didn't. Because there are some things a father doesn't abandon, even if they are despised." The crowd held its breath. I held the portrait high, extending it in front of everyone. "This portrait was not painted with money," I said, "but with sacrifice. With the nights I didn't sleep. With the years, I refused to give up. Every brushstroke carries my story. Every color, my name. Levi covered his face with his hands. Dad, please stop. No, son, I replied. Stop is what I did when I saw you feel ashamed of me. Today I didn't come to complain. I came to remind you where you come from. Suddenly, the applause started. Tentative at first, then stronger. The colleagues, the guests, even the dean's wife, everyone was applauding. Levi fell to his knees, crying. I looked at him without pride, without resentment, only with a serenity I hadn't known before. I approached, placed my hand on his shoulder, and whispered, There is no shame in humble beginnings. The shame is in forgetting who taught you to rise. He nodded through his tears. He tried to embrace me, but I stepped back. Not yet, I told him. Not until you learn what it truly means to love. I turned around, holding the portrait, and walked toward the exit through the applause. Each step was a farewell, every look a wound closing. And when I crossed the threshold, I knew that something had ended forever. I was no longer the invisible father who painted in silence. I was a man who had learned that dignity too is created stroke by stroke. That night when I left the convention center with the portrait in my hands, I felt the air was mine again. The moon hung over the sky like an old companion, and the city lights reflected in the gold leaf, giving it an almost magical glow. There was no music or applause outside, only the silence of a man who had said what he needed to say without shouting. I walked slowly back to my apartment. Each step echoed on the quiet street, like one more brushstroke closing forever the wound my son had left me. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I had cried so much in my life that night I was empty. Only my heart ached. But not from sadness, from exhaustion. When I arrived, I hung the portrait in front of the mirror. It was beautiful. Too beautiful for rejection. But what no one knew, not even Levi, was that inside that portrait was something more than paint and canvas. There was a hidden message. Weeks before the graduation, when I decided to rescue the portrait, I didn't just restore it. I transformed it into a silent letter. Behind the canvas, between the wooden frame and the backing, I placed small handwritten notes, carefully folded pieces of paper where I had left fragments of my story, his childhood, my soul. In one of them, I wrote, When you were born, I thought life had given me back what it took away. I never imagined that love could also hurt when given too freely. In another, I painted your nursery with secondhand paint, but with hands full of hope. I didn't know that someday you would be ashamed of the love that sheltered you. And in the last one, the smallest, the most secret, I put a phrase that had been my father's. The bond between a father and his son is not broken. It only stretches until one of them learns to hold on. I didn't know if Levi would find those notes. I didn't know if he would ever have the courage to look beneath the surface. But I did it anyway, because sometimes you paint words so they can speak when silence is no longer enough. Over the following days, the graduation was the talk of the entire art community. Some former students came to congratulate me, others just to gossip. I listened to them in silence while I worked in my studio. I didn't like discussing it, not because I was ashamed, but because I knew the true ending had not yet arrived. And it arrived sooner than I imagined. 3 days later, Levi appeared at my door. He was pale, his eyes red, and his voice broken. Dad, can we talk? I stood still. For a second, I wanted to embrace him, but something inside me told me to wait. Of course, I replied calmly. He walked in slowly, as if he feared the apartment would reject him too. He sat in the chair where he had waited so many times for me to finish painting a school project, a birthday card, a memory. He carried the portrait in his hands. He placed it on the table without looking at me. I opened it, he said. I found your letters. The silence filled with his ragged breathing. For the first time, I saw him vulnerable. He was no longer the polished executive from the graduation. He was my little boy again. I didn't know, he whispered. I didn't know how much you had sacrificed for me. I lowered my gaze. You didn't have to know. Fathers don't count the brushstrokes. We just paint. I was such a fool, Dad. No, son, I said. You were human, and ambition is also inherited, just like the color of your eyes. Levi broke down crying. He knelt beside me just like when he was little. He took my hands, and I felt them tremble just like mine. Forgive me. You don't have to ask for forgiveness, I said. You have to learn. We stayed like that in silence. I didn't cry because forgiveness, when it's sincere, doesn't hurt. It brings relief. Levi rested his head on my shoulder, and for an instant, I felt the weight of his childhood again. The same warmth, the same fragility. It was as if the years had reversed. After a while, he looked up. "Can I stay with you for a few days?" he asked. "Of course," I replied, smiling. "But you'll have to earn your keep. Painting, cleaning, cooking, living." That night, we ate dinner together for the first time in years. The silence between us was no longer uncomfortable. It was warm, necessary. Levi ate quietly, watching me from time to time as if he were seeing a stranger. "I always thought you were weak," he said suddenly. "And now I know you were just tired." "Yes, son," I replied with a smile. "Love can exhaust you too." The next day, while he slept, I took the portrait and stored it in a wooden box. I didn't do it to keep it as a trophy, but as a testimony, proof that even the most broken bonds can be restored if one has the courage to accept the scars. Before closing the box, I added one last note. "When you read this, perhaps I will no longer be here, but I want you to remember that humility is not inherited. It is learned, and you, my son, have already made the first stroke." I closed the box carefully and put it away in the closet next to my paints, my brushes, and the remnants of the blue canvas from his childhood room. Everything that had been my life, everything that once defined me now fit into that quiet corner. And for the first time in many years, I felt peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of one who has restored his soul and left it whole with the scars visible. The days Levi spent with me were different from anything we had lived before. For the first time in years, we shared breakfast, conversations, and silences that no longer hurt. I painted in my studio, and he sat by the window watching me. Sometimes he would awkwardly paint with me, smudging his fingers, laughing through frustration when the colors didn't blend right. It was like seeing him become the boy who used to ask why Dad's paintings were always the most meaningful, even if they weren't in museums. But peace, like everything in life, doesn't last long when there are unresolved wounds. One afternoon, as we were washing dishes, the phone rang. Levi dried his hands and answered. His face changed instantly. "It's Richard Lawson," he murmured, his boss's name, the CEO of his company. Levi listened in silence, his expression growing more tense. When he hung up, he told me in a low voice, "He's coming for dinner tomorrow. He says he wants to talk to me and to you." The plate in my hand nearly slipped. "With me?" I asked. "Yes, Dad." He said, "It's important." "Then let him come," I said firmly. "But let him come with honesty, not just politeness." That night I didn't sleep, not out of fear, but out of intuition. There was something about Richard Lawson that felt familiar, something I couldn't quite place. I spent the hours cleaning the small apartment, preparing a simple dinner, not because I wanted to impress him, but because respect is never lost, even if others forget it. When the clock struck 7, the sound of the doorbell cut through the silence. Levi opened the door. The man walked in wearing an expensive suit and carrying himself with practiced authority. One of those people whose presence tries to fill every room. "Good evening," he said, barely glancing at me. "Good evening," I replied. "Please come in." We sat at the small dining table. For the first few minutes, no one spoke. Levi pretended to be calm, but his hands fidgeted with his napkin. Richard toyed with his glass, avoiding looking at me. I waited because I knew that truths, sooner or later, reveal themselves. "I suppose you don't remember me," Richard finally began. "No, sir," I said. "But my memory doesn't forget the voices that wound, and yours at the graduation was clear." Levi pressed his lips together. The man sighed, lowering his gaze. "You're right, and I came specifically for that reason." There was a long silence. Only the clock dared to speak. He continued, "Many years ago, when I was starting out, I took art classes at a community center. There was an instructor there, a man who painted better than anyone I'd ever seen, even though he was barely paid. I was arrogant, dismissive, and I mocked his work. I called it hobby art and said real artists didn't teach in places like that. Until one day, that instructor stopped coming. I found out he had lost his wife and had a young son. My hands froze. My heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying?" I asked. The man looked at me with glistening eyes. "That instructor was you." For a moment, the world stopped. I remembered that community center from so many years ago. I remembered his young face, his expensive sketchbook, his condescending tone. "Yes, it was you, Mr. Lawson. The same young man who told me I'd wasted my talent on teaching." "I didn't know," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "I did know," Richard replied. "The day of the graduation. When I saw you in the hall, I recognized you, but I didn't have the courage to approach you because shame weighs more than success." Levi looked at me, horrified. "You taught him, Dad?" I nodded. "Yes, son. And it was from his words that I learned never to let anyone define my worth. Richard bowed his head. I came to ask for your forgiveness. You can't imagine how much I've carried that guilt. I thought success made me better. But when I saw you that night with that portrait in your hands, I understood that I had spent my entire life chasing what I never had. Integrity. Levi cried silently. I took a deep breath, looking at this man who had hurt me so much. And for the first time, I didn't see an enemy. I saw someone who, like my son, had lived deceived by his own pride. Forgiveness is not asked for with words, Mr. Lawson, I said calmly. It is shown with actions. I know. That's why I came. And I want to help. Help me do what? Open your own art school. A real one. Levi looked up, surprised. My father, an art school? Yes, Richard replied. With your talent, you could teach others. I can provide the funding, not to clear my conscience, but to do something meaningful with what I once used to hurt. I looked at him in silence. Inside, a part of me wanted to reject his offer, to say that forgiveness cannot be bought with money. But another part, the wiser part, the one that had learned to restore broken things, told me that sometimes accepting help is also an act of self-respect. All right, I finally said. I accept, but with one condition. Anything you want, Richard replied. The school will carry my wife's name. What was her name? Aurora, because she was the light that guided me when everything was dark. Levi stood up from the table and embraced me tightly. Dad, I can't believe it. Believe it, son. Life doesn't always offer revenge, but it does offer redemption. And sometimes when life turns full circle, teachers remind executives how to see with the heart. Richard nodded, wiping his eyes. You're right. Success fades. Character remains. And humility, I added, is not bought with money. It is earned through humility. The dinner ended with a different silence, the silence of things that finally find their place. Before leaving, Richard shook my hand. Thank you for letting me make this right. Thank you for having the courage to return, I replied. When the door closed, Levi looked at me with eyes full of pride. Dad, I didn't know you were so strong. No, son, I'm not strong. I just learned that the firmest foundations are built after you've been broken. The following week, I received another unexpected visitor. A letter arrived from the City Arts Council. Inside was a handwritten note in elegant script. We have heard about your work and your story. We would like to honor you at our annual gala. The envelope also contained an invitation to speak about perseverance in art. I stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Levi was with me when I opened it. Dad, you have to go. I shook my head, smiling. I'm just a teacher, son. No, Dad. You're more than that. You're proof that dignity matters more than recognition. On the night of the gala, I put on my old suit, the same one I'd worn to the graduation. Levi insisted on coming with me, and when I stepped onto the small stage, I felt the years of pain dissolve like watercolors in rain. In front of me were artists, students, teachers, all with similar stories of struggle, rejection, and quiet perseverance. I took the microphone and took a deep breath. I am nothing more than a painter, I said. But over the years, I learned that no canvas is so damaged that it cannot be restored if you handle it with patience and care. And the strongest paint is not the one that shines brightest, but the one that endures. There was a long, deep round of applause that I felt in my bones. As I stepped down from the stage, I saw Richard Lawson among the audience. He approached slowly with a genuine smile. I knew you would inspire them, he told me. No one inspires alone, I replied. We only move forward when we learn to create with the hearts of others. That same night, back home, I found Levi waiting for me on the small balcony with his daughter, my granddaughter Lily. The little girl was playing with a paintbrush. Look what I found in the studio, Grandpa, she said, smiling. Can I keep it? I watched her for an instant. The brush seemed to glow under the moonlight. I nodded. Of course, my love, but promise me you will take care of it. Why? Because that brush connects the artists of this family. When you hold it, you are never alone. Lily held it close and continued playing. Levi looked at me with glistening eyes. Do you think she'll understand someday? Yes, son, I replied. She'll understand when she creates her first meaningful piece. That's when she'll know that this brush is not just a tool. It is an inheritance. Over time, the Aurora Art School grew. Students came from other neighborhoods, even young people who had never picked up a paintbrush. Some brought wounds that couldn't be seen, a loss, a betrayal, a harsh word from childhood. And every time someone arrived, I told them the same thing. Take a blank canvas and start creating. It doesn't matter if you make mistakes. I'll teach you how to fix them. Because painting, in the end, is not just about making beautiful images. It's about understanding that mistakes also create patterns, and that imperfections, just like scars, are proof that life was lived bravely. One winter, Richard fell ill. Levi and I went to visit him. He lived alone in a large but empty penthouse. He received us with a blanket over his legs and a peaceful look. "I knew you would come," he said. "I wanted to say goodbye properly." I took his hand. "You owe me nothing, Richard." "No, I owe you everything. You taught me to see." And to Levi, he said, "Your father is one of those men born once in a generation. Don't judge him for his struggles. It's his way of staying whole." He passed away a few weeks later. In his will, he left a substantial donation to the Aurora Art School. Nothing extravagant, but enough to ensure it would continue running for many more years. And in a small note written in weak handwriting, he said, "Thank you for restoring with the brush of forgiveness what I had destroyed with pride." I cried when I read it, not from sadness, but from peace, because I understood that in the end, each of us had done our part. He by seeking redemption, and I by learning not to hold bitterness. Today, as I write these lines, I hear Lily laughing on the balcony. She is learning to paint with Levi using the brush she found that night. Her small, clumsy hands move across the canvas carefully, and even though she makes mistakes from time to time, she keeps smiling. That smile is the purest legacy I can leave her. I watch her from my chair and think that life, in the end, is a lot like a painting. Sometimes it gets smudged. It tears. The colors bleed. But always, always, there is a brush ready to create something new. I was a painter, a husband, a father, and now I am a teacher. I painted dreams, tears, and destinies. And if I learned anything, it is that love is not always expressed in words or gestures. Sometimes it is expressed in the silence of one who, despite everything, keeps creating. I close my eyes and remember the first night, the one when my son called my work amateur and left it by the trash. If someone had told me then that it would be the beginning of our healing, I wouldn't have believed it. But now I know that the deepest wounds are not open to destroy us, but so that the light can enter through them. This will be my last story, the last brushstroke I make with these hands that are now trembling. But I am not afraid because I know that when I am gone, Levi and Lily will continue painting with the same vision, honoring the legacy of love, dignity, and truth. And when the world judges them for being too humble or for giving too much without expecting anything in return, they will remember my words. There is no firmer foundation than that built by someone who has fallen. Because one who has fallen knows how to hold the brush with grace. I smile, close my eyes, and let the silence embrace me. The paintbrush rests on my lap, warm, vibrant, as if it still has a life of its own. And just before I drift off, I think I hear Aurora's voice, soft, distant, saying, "You can rest now, my love. The last stroke has been painted." Sometimes people ask me if I would live through everything I went through again, if I would endure the rejection, the tears, the invisibility once more. And I always answer the same. Yes, because every wound taught me to create with greater purpose. Every dismissal taught me not to beg for validation. And every sleepless night reminded me that dignity is the only masterpiece that must never be abandoned. Today I look at my hands and see in them the story of all the artists who, like me, learned to paint not out of fame but out of necessity. Artists who restored dreams, hearts, and families. Artists who did not wait for applause, only respect, and who understood that you do not need wealth to have worth. My school remains open, and every time I hear the sound of a brush on canvas, I feel life whispering to me that nothing was in vain. Because even though the years pass, the brush is still there. Connecting generations, connecting loves, connecting stories. Did this story touch your heart? Which city are you listening from? Let's connect in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey, you can support me by sending a super thanks, so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your beautiful support. I'm looking forward to reading your thoughts on this story. On the screen, you can see 2 more life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story, with love and respect.